in January probably, and one in the spring. I'm Professor Sara Seck, for those of you who don't know me, and I'm going to be moderating the session today. We have a really exciting set of speakers who are going to touch and introduce us to two distinct but quite related themes. So first, in the realm of hard criminal law, we're going to learn about Canada's anti-corruption legislation, which criminalizes the bribery of foreign officials. And we're also going to learn about the serious consequences that flow from increased enforcement of this legislation and related recent amendments. And secondly, we're going to learn about Canadian and global developments relating to transparency of payments in the resource extraction context. And here, the role of law, if in fact we get law in Canada specifically on this, is going to really be to serve as a driver of corporate social responsibility by requiring public disclosure of payments rather than the sort of hard criminal law stick that's used to enforce something that is wrongful. To lead us through this, we have, as I say, four fantastic speakers. We're going to begin with Patrice, who's a senior investigator and outreach coordinator with the RCMP, who has over 30 years of experience in criminal enforcement. But among other activities, Officer Poitevin provides advice on good practices that will minimize risks so as to enhance the role of businesses in preventing and fighting corruption. Our second speaker is Janne Boscariol, who is a partner at McCarthy, Tetrault in Toronto and leader of the firm's international trade and investment group. He advises both private and public sector clients on various things, including anti-corruption laws and policies. And he's very active in ABA and CBA groups, including as a member of the Joint Committee on Anti-Corruption for the CBA. Third, we have Claire Woodside, who's the director of Publish What You Pay Canada, and also a board member of Transparency International. Publish What You Pay Canada was part of the Resource Revenue Transparency Working Group, along with the Mining Association of Canada and the Prospector Developers Association of Canada. And Claire's going to speak to us today about this initiative and related global developments. And then last but most certainly not least, we have Janne Duncan, who's a corporate and securities lawyer with Norton, Fulbright in Toronto. Her practice includes a focus on the global mining sector. And she's also active in the developing areas of corporate social responsibility, global business ethics, and anti-corruption practice. Janne is also the relationship partner for Women in Mining in Toronto branch and Women in Capital Markets. So welcome to all of our speakers. Everybody has, I said, between 12 and 15 minutes each, and then we'll have time for some discussion to draw together all of our ideas. Over to you, Patrice.
Thank you. Well, thank you for inviting me. And how many future lawyers do we have in the room? Okay, I feel intimidated, like I'm going to be cross-examined or something. But basically, my job, not just being investigator, but outreach coordinator, is to work with business executives and corporations to try to mitigate the risk. So it's to fill the gap of need to know and trying to help them. Because it's not, a bunch of criminals out there, even though they have $5,000 money suits. It is important to work collaboratively with businesses to help them mitigate risk, to help them understand what the red flags are, and to work with them to try to prevent corruption from happening in the first place. When we talk about corruption, well, we're talking about ethics and greed. It's about money. It's about lack of ethics and governance. And the best example is actually this video.
50 pounds! 50! 90! 90! 200 pounds! 200 pounds of this! Anyone else? Going, go! 210!
So we have lack of ethics, and we have greed, people get hurt. And that illustrates it very well for me. Yes, it's humorous, but it's also serious in terms that you've got public officials, you have representatives that have a mission to help people, but then they line their pocket to the detriment of the population. And that's what we're talking When we talk about corruption, you need to know about Transparency International. It's a non-profit organization that works around the world to identify and themselves minimize risk. And they have a corruption perception index. So rating the countries where you have more corruption. And if you look at the dark colors, it's where you have more corruption than other places. Well, Canada lists itself as 9th place. Okay? So it's not too bad. We're not immune. Nobody's immune to it. But it shows you from a business and legal standpoint where the risks are, where the companies need to address it from that perspective. Now, what is corruption? How do you define it? There's many definitions. There's many ways that you can associate action and activities to corruption. Hire a public official and qualified person to contract. It is about getting an advantage. It is about a public official, about their greed to be able to offer some business advantage to a business that will provide them not just money. It can be interest. It could be anything. It's not just about the exchange of money, but it's about the benefit to that individual and to that company itself. Now, when we talk about corruption, if any of you know about the fraud triangle, this is the corruption square, because you have to have many factors come into play to have corruption for it to thrive. Opportunity, obviously, is one of them. Need, personal greed, that's where the greed is. We want, the people want money. Rationalizations, well, everybody does it. It's just the cost of doing business. And the last one that's important is tolerance, meaning the corporate culture. When you have it acceptable, when everybody within the corporation says, well, we need to get that contract, I don't care how, you have a corporate culture that lacks ethics. You don't have any governance, where you imply that I don't care how you get the contract, I just want you to get it. So when you have this type of environment, it mushrooms into the corruption and bribery that occurs because it's allowed corporately to happen. So it's important to look at it from the global perspective because it is a global problem. That's why the OECD convention, that's why we have the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. You have a global effort now to stamp out corruption because it has huge impact. And Canada is signatory to these, the OECD and the UNCAC. So we are obliged to enact laws. We are accountable globally on what we do to stamp out corruption. We report back to the OECD every year as to our efforts. So it is a global effort, okay, and everybody needs to understand that we have globally, we need to be able to address it cooperatively. Now, it's not simply about the laws. If you look from a social media perspective, you have civil society calling for this, calling for a greater enforcement, calling for greater accountability and transparency. And it's civil society that's driving some of these efforts. And it is a combination of laws and civil society that will help us try to stamp it out more effectively. But when we talk about the corporate culture, I equate this change that we're seeing to what happened 25 years ago with drinking and driving. 25 years ago, drinking and driving was socially acceptable. People were doing it. It was a badge of honor to get home while you were drunk. You were hanging 2 trees, a dog, a cat, and whatever else. Now it's no longer socially acceptable. You will agree with me that all of you will jump on your friend if they're drunk and take away their keys, right? Well, in terms of corporate social norms, we're at the cusp of that change in terms of corruption. So it will take time for it to really have an impact and change that corporate culture so that we will be able to address corruption more effectively. But if you look at, just going back, the Y generation, you guys, the Y and Z generation, one of the things that's important to understand is that most of you, your generation, because you're so connected through social media, you're connected with people around the world, you're much less accepting of unethical behavior. You will be more accepting of companies. You will try to thrive to work with companies that are more ethical. So you guys will be driving this change as well. You will be bringing those ethics to the company that you will work with so that eventually you'll change the corporate culture. Now, it's not simply about the impact on the company that pays a bribe. If you look at the Rana Plaza collapse, everybody remember the Rana Plaza collapse, the building in Bangladesh where you had garment industry. Over 1,100 people died because the owner of the building was corrupt. They paid bribes to the engineers and the city inspectors to build this unsafe structure. And it collapsed, it killed people. But Loblaws was affected because their supply chain was involved. Now, Loblaws did not pay a bribe, but their stock took a hit. Their brands took a hit. There was boycotts against this company because they were associated to corruption. So it's not just a company that pays a bribe. So corruption everywhere has an impact on business. And people and companies need to understand this. Also, you have to put a picture to this. So it's not just about the money. It's the impact on the countries where corruption thrives. In terms of economic development, in terms of political, in terms of threats, in terms of terrorism, in terms of just people getting their basic liberties, like schools and roads. So when the foreign officials line their pockets, when you have this plutocracy where they steal from the society themselves, they can't develop economically. So there's a demand on the supply side, okay, but whenever a company pays a bribe, they just contribute to the cycle of corruption, and we need to be able to address it. It has huge impact on business. So what you have today is a huge ethical and legal risk to corruption to business. It's one of the highest legal and ethical risks. So companies need to understand where they're situated, their risk assessment, their due diligence. They need to understand where they're at, and this is where you can play a role in educating them. Not simply saying, don't do it. It's how to be able to mitigate those risks with the proper tools and the proper approach. Because ultimately, corruption is about a theft of business opportunity. Because when a company gets that contract for paying a bribe, all the other ones that want to operate ethically are losing that business opportunity. And once you start getting in bed with a foreign official that wants to get that bribe, once you put a target on your head saying, I'm willing to pay a bribe, you're going to be targeted for shakedowns. Because that first $20,000, guess what? You're going to get that license, you're going to operate, you're going to set up all your business, and then they're going to come back, oh, by the way, I have a tax for you now. Oh, I need something more. So it's a vicious cycle that never stops. So it's not just that one payment. So what is our response? Well, because we're signatories of the OECD and UNCAT, we have the, Corruption of Foreign Public Officials Act in Canada. So it's extraterritorial. So it's not just companies here operating in Canada. This is specifically for companies, individuals, citizens, residents, Canadian residents that are operating outside of Canada that get involved in bribery and corruption. We investigate them. We can charge them. So your activities as a corporation outside of Canada, we can investigate, prosecute for it. And when we talk about this, it's directly or indirectly gives, offers, agrees to give, offer a loan, advantage, or benefit of any kind. And it's not just simply exchange of money. It can be a gift. It can be a trip. Having your daughter going to Canadian University, there's an advantage right there. So anything of that nature. And what's important here is not simply having exchange. It's the conspiracy. Agreeing to do that by itself is an offense. So we don't have to prove the exchange of money. And with the latest amendments from last year, what has changed is now books and records. So if you try to hide those bribes under any matter, that by itself is an offense. Because of course, how many companies will actually say, I'm paying a bribe on their line? You think they're going to do that? No, they're going to hide it under various ways. So cooking the books is an offense. National jurisdiction, where before we had to prove it directly to Canada. Now it's any Canadian company, Canadian individual, Canadian residents can be charged, investigated. But also a foreign person working for the Canadian company. So that territorial link still applies. And we've just charged recently a number of individuals, Americans, UK, and others. They're not Canadian citizens, but they work for a Canadian company. So we are charging them. So whenever they land into a country where you have a treaty for extradition, they can be brought back to Canada to face those charges. Facilitation payments. I think you'll talk about it a little later. The penalty is increased from 5 years to 14 years. So it's people going to jail now. And we have a case that we'll talk shortly that it's not simply the company that's being charged, it's individuals being charged. And in terms of fine for company, it's unlimited. Now it's just the RCMP that is able to lay charges, but we work with other agencies to help them. But it is the RCMP's responsibility to lay the charges. Now it's not just companies that make profit, it's also non-profit organizations that have to follow those rules. So they have to account for this. What's important is not just the CFPOA, there's related charges. So any company that makes a profit, they make $200 million from having obtained a contract through a bribe, well, that's proceed of crime. So we can go after that. An executive that threatens an employee not to go to the police, that's a charge by itself. An executive that's willful blind about the activity that's happening in their company. So there's multiple associated charges to this under the criminal code. So it's not just about the CFPOA, it's everything else that we can find that will lay charges to. Few cases, I'm not going to go into details because John's going to cover a few of them, but what's important here with those cases is that we have created precedent, specifically with Nazia Karagar case. First individual convicted at trial, 3 years in jail, but it also created judicial precedent in terms that it provided a precedent, legal precedent that we don't have to prove the exchange of money. That was confirmed through this case. Just the discussion alone, just the agreement alone is enough to lay a charge. So it is these types, we don't have a lot of cases in comparison to the United States and the UK, but those cases also show that it's in the individual, not just the company, that's being charged. The difference too between Nico and Griffith. Griffith was fully cooperative with the police. They had voluntary disclosure, they opened the books, they waived privilege. And they had a smaller sentence in comparison to Nico in terms of the bribe. They didn't have a probation period like Nico. But they did their due diligence. They proved that when they found a new board found illegal activity from the old board, they were going to an IPO and say, wait a minute, let's divulge this to the police. They didn't take a hit on their stock. Okay, because they demonstrated to the market that they were clean, that they wanted to get rid of this problem and deal with it effectively. Nico was a little different story. 3-year probation that they had to show. They're reporting to the police and have an audit paid by them to demonstrate they were clean, that they applied a very strong compliance program. This is the very important slide where you're looking at the high cost of corruption in business. So it's not simply about the fine itself. Companies need to realize the huge cost of getting involved in this type of activities. From the audit itself, with just Griffith, the audit for cleaning up was almost as high as the fine itself. Simmons, another example, they have $1.3 billion fine. It cost them over close to $1 billion to implement compliance because it was after the fact. Impact on productivity. When your company is not concentrating their business activity on the core business, they're concentrating on defending themselves, you're not effective anymore. You're not as productive. Civil liability. Shareholders, if you are involving criminal behavior, you're liable to get your shareholders to sue you because you're being negligent. Successor liability. Well, nobody wants to buy your company if you've got this big cloud over your head. And any extractive industry, the small caps, want to be bought out. That's their dream. Well, they're not going to be bought out because they're going to have successor liability. So having been involved in this stops you from being attractive in terms of mergers and acquisitions. Impact on brand. We've seen it with lot laws and others. So when you tank stock, your stock tanks because of the fact that you're involved in corruption. Impacts on your shareholders' equity. It impacts on your business. Another one, in terms of legitimacy, now your directors and executives, insurance. When you're involved in corruption, yeah, your insurance will pay for you going to trial, but guess what? Now the insurance is going to come back once you're convicted to get that money back. And good luck trying to get more coverage. And if you don't get liability coverage, you may not get financing. So all this is to say that it has huge costs, huge impact on business, if you're not ethically conducting business. Solution, well, there's many of them, but you've got to concentrate your activity on looking at having a level playing field. And you can't, as an executive, just like your head in the sand and say, it's just going to go away, it's not my business, I don't care. Because you're facing a lot of pressure as a business. You're facing pressures from your competitors, you're facing pressures from us. You're facing pressure in terms of business, so how are you going to deal with it? How are you going to manage it? So it is about looking at a GRC process, looking at governance, looking at risk management, looking at compliance. If you establish a good, strong compliance, not a paper exercise, strong compliance, it will have an impact on your business. And when we come in, if we investigate, instead of going after the whole company, it may be just a rogue agent within the company. Because you're demonstrating that you're doing your job to mitigate your risk and your exposure. It is critical to have this. Because ultimately, it's how you change your business culture. And that, for me, is the most important thing. It's not just saying, we're ethical. On our site, we've got this beautiful little saying, we're an ethical company. So you have the compliant, you talk about compliance in the morning with all the employees. Don't commit bribe. Just like saying, don't do drugs. Okay. If you don't really have the tone from the top, if you don't really change your business culture, in the afternoon, you get the pressure from the sales manager saying, I don't care how you get the contract, I want you to get it. Understand? It just eliminates everything about the corporate culture and the message about being compliant, about being ethical. So it has to be a tone from the top. Finish is a contract should be one on the quality of service and the product, not the amount of the bribe. That's the critical issue. Thank you.
I'm going to stand up as well, just so I can see my PowerPoint as I flip through.
I'll change it for you.
Okay. As Professor Seck said, my name is John Boscariol. I'm a partner at a law firm called McCarthy Tetrault. My practice is international trade and investment, but when I really hone down into what I do, it really is anti-corruption, economic sanctions, export controls, defense trade controls. It really comes down to understanding who you're doing business with, who's benefiting from your goods or services, what's the nature of your goods or services, if those are controlled or subject to any kind of technology transfer control. Are you dealing with blacklisted entities? All these kind of questions come up. Anti-corruption is a part of that. But when we're looking at issues of supply chain transparency, what can happen in your supply chain, whether you're a mining company, a consumer products company, an oil and gas company, today it is a very exciting time for students in this area because it's not just anti-corruption we're looking at economic sanctions, and there's certainly a tie-in between the two. Export controls, anti-money laundering, dealing with politically exposed persons, the environmental impacts of what's going on in your supply chain, employment standards, working conditions, conflict minerals. Again, if you've got a jewelry product or an electronic product you have in Canada that you're selling in Canada, working your way back to determine whether the conflict minerals used in that product were taken from a mine in the Congo. We're all starting to see laws in various jurisdictions on these issues. The United States tends to be a little more aggressive with bringing these in, but Canada is pretty close behind. And to give you the sense of, just to give you an example of what the connections are between anti-corruption and economic sanctions. Patrice mentioned the SNC-Lavalin case. SNC, 5 individuals have been charged so far, ex-officers of SNC Lavalin. Those charges have to do with corruption issues that have arisen in Algeria, Libya, and I think there's a few
Bangladesh.
and Bangladesh. There's a few other countries they're still looking at. But those charges also have to do with violating economic sanctions. They're operating in countries that are high risk. I'm not here to tell you or businesses not to operate in high-risk countries, but the fact is, if you are operating in jurisdictions like that, where there is potential for corruption, often those places are run by dictators. They are often subject to economic sanctions. When those dictators leave and someone pulls back the curtain, there are other parties there that are incentivized to bring forward potential allegations of corruption. And we find out that Canadian companies have been doing business with these dictators in one way or another that violates economic sanctions. So all these things are kind of tied together. Today I want to focus on, though, on anti-corruption. I think it is one of the laws and policies that are kind of at the heart of what Patrice was getting to, but when he talks about the Rana Plaza disaster, collapsing, and so many people getting killed. Some may say, well, that's because of lax standards there, lax building standards. But really, as Patrice said, you dig behind that, that's corruption that caused that. And that is at the heart of what I think Canada and other countries are trying to get at with their anti-corruption legislation. So often I start with, when I'm speaking to companies, what are the consequences of non-compliance in this area? And Patrice, you've covered this already in terms of penalties, in terms of investigation and audit costs. Griffiths, you mentioned $5 million in that case, just to do the internal investigation to come clean to the RCMP. Siemens was quite, I guess they're approaching $1 billion with Siemens for that. Avon products being investigated under the FCPA in the United States right now. They're above $300 million in their costs. Again, no penalties. Walmart is the other one. They're above $400 million, I think, right now in their costs. No penalties yet. Those are investigative costs. Hiring lawyers, hiring accountants, forensic accountants, going through their operations around the world to determine whether they have any corruption issues. Patrice covered all the kind of reputational impact. There are impacts on share price. This pattern that we've seen in the United States of shareholder lawsuits, as soon as a public company announces that they are coming forward to either the SEC or the Department of Justice, and they make that public, the plaintiff lawyers come out of the woodwork. They're launching class action lawsuits on behalf of shareholders who are taking the position that the share value, the drop in the share value, the damage or loss to them is caused by the fact that the officers and directors of these organizations did not have internal controls around corruption. They permitted this to occur. It was done on their watch. That is not a criminal standard, and that's an important distinction to remember. In Canada, this is only enforced on a criminal basis. When we look at those shareholder lawsuits, well, first when we look at the FCPA in the United States, it's both criminal and civil. When you look at shareholder actions, that's obviously, those are civil cases, so they're not held to a criminal standard. The one, just 2 points I would add to what Patrice said about that. One is on the M&A side, transactions. At our firm, we tend to act for acquirers. A lot of our work has to do with doing due diligence on targets as to whether they're complying with economic sanctions and anti-corruption laws. There are a lot of small, junior Canadian companies out there that are looking to go public. They're looking to be acquired by a larger company. Maybe they're looking for bank financing, or they're dealing with private equity, where when they go to those sources of financing, they are shocked to hear that they should have a compliance program in place for anti-corruption and economic sanctions. With a lot of these companies, obviously mining companies happen to be dealing in some very high-risk areas in the world. But even oil and gas companies, they're going into jurisdictions where other companies fear to tread, and in particular U.S. companies. So we have a lot of instances where Canadian companies, particularly in oil and gas, where they have just thrived by jumping into Syria, Iran, Libya, at a time when it wasn't clear that the sanctions are aggressive as they are today, doing business in those jurisdictions, not having an adequate compliance program in place. And the consequences during that transaction, when we get in there and look at that, first we get kind of the blind look, deer caught in headlights look from the executives when they say to us, well, why does this even matter? The acquirers, or even private equity guys, if you talk to them, especially from the United States, extremely sensitive about these issues. We've had situations where deals have been delayed. We've had situations where those acquirers have actually walked away because the target didn't have an effective program in place. And typically, if you uncover some issue, you don't have time to do a full investigation to determine how serious it is, but often in those situations, there's enough there to create concern for the potential investor or acquirer that they will walk away. So this goes to the intrinsic value of your organization, and particularly if you're looking at sort of the business plan of your typical entrepreneur in the mining area. It is, identify opportunities, grow, eventually cash out. They're not going to be able to follow that plan, whether it's being acquired or going public, if they've got issues on the anti-corruption side. That tends to get their attention when you explain it to them that way, and certainly I think that may be helping turn the tide right now in Canada. I think we're still about 10 years behind the U.S. on some of these issues, at least on the awareness side in the business community. In terms of the cases, we've had this legislation since 1999 in force in Canada, the CFPOA. There's been minimal enforcement until recently. We had a little blip of a case called HydroClean. It was a case in which a Canadian company was bribing a U.S. customs officer to make it easy, to actually make things more difficult for their competitors' employees who are entering the United States. The Canadian company, the amount of the bribe was actually more than the fine. The amount of the bribe was $30,000, $35,000. The fine was $25,000. And the company was fined. And that case has been kind of held up as a bit of an embarrassment for Canada. For a long time, it's really the only case we had on record. Canada then got their hands slapped a bit by the OECD. We did sign the UN Convention Against Corruption, UNCAC. The RCMP started 2 units for investigating corruption, specifically under the CFPOA, one in Calgary, one in Ottawa. And then we started seeing the cases come forward. The first case in which there was actually a conviction after putting aside that blip was Nitro Resources. So June of 2011, Nitro Resources pled guilty. It was in connection with providing a vehicle and some travel benefits to a minister in Bangladesh, a minister with whom they were negotiating a compensation arrangement for a blowout that occurred there. Interestingly, they, in addition to giving him a Toyota 4Runner, which was worth about $190,000, so it was fully decked out, you can imagine, they paid for him to come to an oil expo in Calgary. That was fine. They then paid for him to go to New York and to go to Chicago to meet family and friends and do some shopping. That part of it was not fine. So they distinguished between those travel benefits, but those were all viewed as being connected with the negotiation of the compensation on the blowout and other dealings they were having with the government at the time. They were being investigated, by the way, for 3 years before they found out. When they did find out, it was through Foreign Affairs in Bangladesh, I believe. They fully cooperated. But they ended up agreeing to a $9.5 million fine plus the 3-year period for probation and monitoring, where PwC was hired to monitor the implementation of a full compliance program in the company. That possibly could be as expensive as the fine. It's a very, very expensive process. The next case was Griffiths Energy. Again, a guilty plea. Pat had mentioned this was one where the board came forward. They were actually in the midst of an IPO. It was discovered that there were some contracts in place that they had with consultants. One was with the wife of the ambassador of Chad to Canada. It was a consulting contract for $2 million plus some founder shares in the company to help the company with its oil and gas developments in Chad. That was viewed clearly as a violation of the CFPOA. That was disclosed, voluntarily disclosed, so they came forward, although I'm not quite sure if you characterize it as voluntary because it was kind of in the midst of eventually an IPO. So I think the feeling was they had to deal with this, they had to do something about it. And they did come forward. They were given a penalty roughly the same size as NICO, but note, the amount of the bribe in NICO was roughly $190,000 to $200,000. The amount of the bribe here was $2 million plus the value of the founder shares. So there was some advantage, or some credit given to the company for coming forward voluntarily in that case. The other conviction we had was of an individual, Nazir Karagar, that Patrick mentioned in connection with some activity an Ottawa company, Cryptometrics, was having with, I guess they were negotiating the supply of facial recognition software for Air India. And he was just recently sentenced to 3 years in jail. And it was our first trial under the CFPOA and our first conviction of an individual under the CFPOA. Right now, the RCMP has stopped giving out numbers on cases, but the most recent point at which they did it was roughly around 35 ongoing investigations of Canadian companies and individuals, many of whom don't know they're being investigated. So I expect that in the next year or so, we're going to see more of these cases come out, not just with respect to the ones we know about, like SNC-Lavalin. There'll be others as well coming forward, and I think that'll mean more for compliance in the community as well as we begin to understand just how prolific this is across the Canadian business community. I think the messages, do I have 2 minutes or? Oh, less than 2 minutes. So the courts have been very clear that excuses like this is the culture in India or Bangladesh or Africa are not acceptable. The law is the law here. And it's not do as the Romans do when in Rome at all. I think they've been crystal clear about that. But one thing I did want to just finish off on was paying attention to the anti-corruption regimes of other jurisdictions as well. We have to worry about Canada's as Canadian companies and Canadian individuals, but the US FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, is applied extraterritorially as well. The UK Bribery Act comes into play. Most importantly now, what we've seen in the last 6 to 12 months is this effort by many of these countries who we have traditionally viewed as being developing and backward in terms of anti-corruption enforcement. They have now been enforcing their domestic laws against foreigners, against foreign companies and foreign individuals. So we've seen that with China, with GlaxoSmithKline's GSK in China. They are jailing foreign officers of that company in China for violations of anti-corruption laws. And most recently in Cuba, you probably saw the news earlier this week, there's a Canadian that was charged, convicted. He's now in a Cuban jail. Whether those charges were trumped up, and I think that's still being debated right now. The fact is, these companies are using these laws in one way or another to go after foreign companies in their jurisdictions who are violating these laws.
Comparatively, how effective are the U.S. and UK regimes to Canada?
Yeah, that's a great question. The U.S. is by far the world leader in enforcement. They've set the tone. When you look at the Canadian cases, we followed very closely in terms of sentencing, in terms of probation orders, in terms of investigation. In fact, the RCMP and the DOJ work very closely together. The U.S. is considered the traditional leader in the area, and they're very aggressive. The U.K. we've really started to pay attention to because the UK Bribery Act is quite aggressive. It prohibits facilitation payments, which are still allowed here in Canada, at least for the time being. It prohibits commercial bribery, so bribery that doesn't involve a government official. But the UK doesn't have the track record of enforcement that the US does. So right now, the US is really...
Any offense for not having compliance program in the UK?
Yeah, the UK does have an offense for not preventing corruption, which is something we don't have here. So I'll stop there. I'm out of time, but I'm happy to ask questions later. I've also given Professor Seck e-copies of articles we've done in each of these areas, so if you're looking for anything more on that, she has those as well. Thanks very much.
So I was going to sit down, but now I'm going to stand up. To follow the crowd, but I don't have a PowerPoint. I will keep an eye on the time, so we have time for questions. I know, I'll keep an eye on the time. So I'm the director of Publish What You Pay Canada, and that is the national coalition of the Publish What You Pay network. And across the world, Publish What You Pay has 800 civil society organizations that are members, and we're active in 52 countries. And essentially, the Publish What You Pay movement came from a number of research reports in actually the late 1990s and early 2000s that showed that money was flowing in, particularly in the oil and gas sector, these sort of secret payments. And one of the seminal reports was about Angola. And money was flowing in, and then it was being used to finance war, big salaries and private palaces for dictators, and all kinds of other things. And at the end of these research reports, there was a call for companies to publish what they pay. And this is how we kind of started this movement, looking at the publication of payments specifically between mining, oil, and gas companies and governments. And I would say that the push for this kind of disclosure spread around the world partly through an initiative called the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. And has anybody heard of that? The EITI sometimes? No? Okay. So this is an initiative that governments choose to adopt, and when they do adopt it, they have to establish a multi-stakeholder working group in the country, so that it has civil society, industry, and government. And then they develop a reporting template, and companies disclose the payments they make to governments, and then governments disclose the payments they receive. And then those two statements are audited, so you can see the differences and the discrepancies. In the first reports that came out of this process when it was implemented in Nigeria showed hundreds of millions of dollars that was being shown to be paid and not be received, or received and not paid, depending on the country. And that initiative is now implemented in many countries around the world. And it has done a lot to foster resource governance and create a dialogue about how resource revenue should be managed and spent. It also does a really good job of shining light on kind of technical issues in how payments are calculated. And at times it's gotten at corruption, but really this initiative is focused on legitimate payments. So what is the company legitimately by law supposed to pay, and do they pay it? So it's still slightly different than looking at the illegitimate payments, which you would under the CFPOA. But one of the things that came out of the EITI process was that a lot of the most corrupt governments in the world said, we're not implementing this voluntary initiative. It's great for you guys, but for us, we'd rather, have our secret payments because it's a little bit easier to operate. So, as a movement, we started to think, well, what do you do? And in the end, you end up kind of like the CFPOA. You end up looking at home state regulation. So host state regulation is where the company operates. so you would look at changing the laws in Chad, in Angola, in Nigeria. And home state regulation looks at where the companies are registered or listed on a stock exchange. And from that came the idea that if we could require all companies that are registered or listed on a US-based stock exchange or EU-based stock exchange or Canadian-based stock exchange to disclose all the payments they make to governments and all levels of government. So federal governments, provincial governments, municipal governments, and not just the payments to the governments, but the payments on the projects they're associated with. So Griffiths, they signed a PSA, a production sharing agreement, and they paid a bribe that helped them facilitate their contract, right? They would have to disclose the payments that they make in accordance with that PSA. So it's based on the project also. And having this kind of detailed information would let stakeholders ask really good informed questions to their governments about where revenue flows were going, in the absence of their governments wanting to voluntarily implement an initiative. It also, when you use home state regulation, you can require really rigorous disclosure. So, the EITI has lots of different processes for the voluntary disclosure, but it's not very timely. So the data often comes 4 years after. But you need data a year after to be able to ask questions of the current government. Because in many countries, not so much our own over the last 2 years, many countries you have a new government every 4 years. So that government who previously received the payments may be long gone by the time you have the disclosure. So this is something we've called mandatory payment disclosure. And the first law that was passed on mandatory payment disclosure was in the US, and it's section 1504 of the Dodd-Frank Act. And it essentially requires all companies listed on US stock exchanges to disclose payments to all levels of government by project and country, with the exception of subnational governments in the US. And that's related to all kinds of federal, state level issues and the way the US government makes laws. And then later, 3 years later in 2013, we saw a similar law in the EU, under the EU Accounting and Transparency and Accounting Directives. And we saw a similar law in Norway. And so in Canada, as a coalition, so I have 15 member organizations that include some nonprofits and some you probably don't, but like World Vision and Care Canada and Transparency International Canada. We thought, how do we advance this in Canada? I mean, we're a sort of extractive sector powerhouse. 60% of the world's mining companies are registered here or listed on our stock exchanges, and a third of the world's oil and gas companies. And they're often the smaller players, which can be more susceptible to signing maybe deals they haven't thought through, or to, having issues with their payments. So it's even more important that we have good rules here. And so the approach we took was to actually work with the mining sector to develop recommendations to the federal government on what the disclosure framework should look like. And the Canadian mining sector has taken a leading role on this issue. I think that they saw this as an opportunity, a bit of a reputational win, but also as an opportunity to get out in front of an issue that was coming for them anyway. So with rules in the US and rules coming in the EU, and lots of countries where they operate implementing the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, their companies were already facing this all the time. So over the course of about 2 years, really a solid year, we negotiated and drafted recommendations to the federal government detailing exactly what we thought payment disclosure standards should look like in Canada. And including all the elements that I spoke about previously. And one of the result was that the Canadian government, and including some pressure internationally, made a commitment to develop such standards and to create such legislation. So we have followed them through that process, and we actually, expect to see the legislation coming this fall. So you should be seeing some legislation tabled, we would guess this fall, that outlines what the disclosure standard that they're going to develop will address. But what will this do? I mean, this is not necessarily going to point to corruption in the figures that are disclosed themselves. Because a company is not going to report necessarily, you know, a corrupt payment, because these are legitimate payments. So these are the payments they're supposed to make by law. But what it will do is it narrows the field for corruption. It makes it harder to engage in corruption because you have to disclose all the payments you're making. It gives the companies a defense mechanism if they're asked for a payment that seems off the books, to say, look, we have to disclose all our payments, so as long as you're okay with us disclosing this in this category. It gives you a comparator. So why, you know, are 10 companies making these payments and this company is not making any payments? Or, you know, what's happening? It gives citizens the ability to ask questions about, you know, the kinds of deals that their governments sign. And I think what it gets to, and I think what, you know, the CFP could also gets to, is this idea of promoting good governance. So payment transparency is another tool of good governance, like the CFPOA. And you have to complement it with lots of other good governance mechanisms to have it work, you know? And one of the things that the payment transparency does is it helps to create the conditions for conversations in host countries, so in the countries where resources are extracted, about how that extraction takes place and how citizens can benefit from the monies that flow from resource wealth. And you know, sometimes we're asked, why just natural resources? Why not everything? You know, and there is actually in the tax world, there's a global push for country-by-country reporting of, you know, on a number of different indices. But one of the reasons that we've focused on sort of natural resources specifically is because they do have this huge transformational potential. So if you can harness the huge wealth that can flow from your natural resources, you can really transform your economy. But the truth is that most countries don't. Most countries that are resource rich face growing poverty, and you know, corruption levels don't necessarily abate, and they don't really see the benefits, or they don't see the benefits they should. And so this is part of, you know, allowing citizens and parliamentarians and journalists to ask really good questions about, you know, where are those benefit flows? How do we make sure that, you know, we get to see development out of this? So I think I'll end there because I'm good on time. Thank you so much.
I really liked all of your presentations, but I liked yours because you started like linking the anti-bribery corruption regime into a number of other areas like economic sanctions, etc. And I would also add lobbying in there. And I would just throw that in there because we think of lobbying as legal, right? Lobbying is paying someone to go to a government official and advance your interests. Which is going to kind of be the kind of my talk, which is a little bit of devil's advocate. I do a lot of work in the emerging market area for mining companies and agriculture companies. And I'm also connected to Norton, which is this global firm which has large investigative practices in, I think, 29 countries. So one of the things that, I'm just going to start with 2 case studies. And this is your typical, these are like real life stories. Okay, you are a company based in Canada, and you're listed on the New York Stock Exchange, which means that you are filed reports, including financial statements, with the Securities and Exchange Commission. You are carrying on business in a number of emerging markets where there is a very high risk of corruption. First of all, the culture is there, and you're also the kind of company that's paying for licenses, you're building roads, you're hiring contractors, and all of these people are speaking a different language than you. Like, they're talking about culture, they also speak a different language, and the paper is not in your language, which is English, or French. So that's your scenario, and you have to get equipment across the border in one of these emerging markets, and the person at customs makes you pay $40 every time you cross the border to get your stuff across. And if you don't get your stuff across, you're losing millions of dollars at your mine site, or, you know, like, I mean, they just will not let it go. So you pay the $40, and it adds up over time, And some clerk in that office keeps a record of all of those cash payments that are being paid over the border, okay? And remember, this is not in English, your head office is in Canada, and you know, you really don't know about this, or you know, you really feel like you have no choice, or you don't know what to do. Just saying no just feels like not an option. As it turns out, I guess you should say no, because clerk in that office takes that record and he goes to the United States and he goes to a US lawyer and he goes to the and the US lawyer says, go to the Wall Street Journal and go to the Securities and Exchange Commission, and this lawyer is like Elliot Spitzer, okay, before the prostitutes. Okay? And he wants a name, and he goes, okay, bingo. And also the penalties are going to go, because I think 60% of the money financed by the Department of Justice. I'm just getting started. So the budget for the Department of Justice is, how much of it is driven by penalties from FCPA, PWYP?
Quite a bit.
Quite a bit. I think it's over 60%. And if you think I'm being cynical, read the New York Times article on civil forfeiture. Okay, so this Elliot Spitzer guy sees this opportunity. He's got now this report, so it's out of the SEC, and it's at the Wall Street Journal, and this guy is a whistleblower. Okay, so he's a whistleblower, so how much does he get?
30%.
30% of the penalties that come from this offense are going to go to that whistleblower. Okay, so there's an incentive for him to blow the horn. And Elliot Spitzer is all over it, and some US lawyer at a private law firm is all over it too, because he's acting for this individual who's the whistleblower. Now, I am telling you, in fact, I have clients who have had a corporate shakedown on whistleblowing, and it has actually been proven that there was no offense, and it cost that client $1 million. Okay, that's number one. Number two, it's a corporate shakedown in one sense, but also the company head office is going, like, we had no ability to manage this. So let's take the because the whistleblower just blows everything off the top before you can finish your internal investigation, before you can have those records translated. So let's say that there was no whistleblower, but that is an actual fact situation. And it is a big concern to officers and directors. Okay, so let's go back to scenario number two. Scenario number two is your corporate compliance program picks up on an issue. It finds that there's no whistleblower, okay? But they pick up on an issue and they know they have to do an internal investigation to decide whether or not to self-report. Okay, so they have to decide, and what you have to do, an internal investigation. Let me just tell you that, you know, when you're talking about the CFPOA, you may as well be talking about the Irish Anti-Bribery and Corruption Act, because today's reality is that international laws and international regulators cooperate. So we're company listed on the New York Stock Exchange. The offense happened in country XYZ, but your financial statements are books and records, right? Or your financial statements reported to the SEC, so you're subject to the SEC. Or let's say you have a director in the UK, then you have, you're subject to the UK Bribery Act. So what do you tell people that are a Canadian client? Well, you tell them that you have to have adequate procedures that comply with international norms, emerging international norms, because seriously, if you try to piece all these things together, you should be including Mozambique, you should be including South Africa, all the countries where you carry on business, and they're very different. So, and you require local, advice to comply with all those different rules. So what you have to do really is just take the high road of international best practices. But okay, so let's go back to my scenario where you're back to an international investigation. First of all, you're on the board of directors. You say to your advisor, what's the concept of materiality here? Well, we've seen from the NICO case that there is no concept of materiality, okay? You had how much penalty? $200,000? No, the bribe was $200,000, the penalty 9.1 because emerging international norms. And the U.S., Elliot Spitzer got in there and imposed U.S. precedents for what the sanctions are going to be. So $9 million penalty, $200,000 bribe. Number two, Walmart effect, we call it. So the Walmart effect is it gets out, whistleblower gets it out, you self-report, it gets out there, and your whole stock price gets wiped out, right? Number three, maybe this happened by a supplier that you don't control. Right? Maybe it's a supplier that's bribing the customs official. So you're responsible now as a director for companies that you don't control. So, you know, you can get a covenant from them that says we agree to not to bribe, but there's no, you know, how do we police that in these third world countries? Then you decide, okay, what are we going to do? International investigation. Well, you get your accountants involved, millions, you know, hundreds of thousands, millions. Let's talk about it. I mean, we're into the millions of dollars now. Then you get something called contract lawyers, which go in and they go through all the documents. You can't believe how often when you type in the word bribe comes out. Oh, look, right. It's like, because you went to your employees or your third-party suppliers and you said, don't pay any bribe. And they said, oh, I didn't pay any bribe, I just paid money to get customs through. You know, like, I mean, you're dealing with a real difference in understanding and cultures. And then they do that search, and then you do this, and then decide, well, whether I'm going to self-report. Okay, so if you self-report, there's something called the Deferred Prosecution Agreement. Okay, is everyone nodding? Deferred Prosecution Agreement is something that is in the United States, Elliott Spitzer's. UK is, I think they've introduced it.
Yeah.
Okay, we don't have it in Canada. Okay, so in Canada, when you enter, a deferred prosecution agreement is something that says, look, I neither confirm nor deny, but I will pay a penalty that looks like $9.1 million just in case to make this all go away. So in Canada, you have to actually plead guilty to get that. You have to say, okay, I'm guilty of an offense. In the UK, you can sign it because we don't have deferred prosecution agreements. I think that's the point I forgot to make. So we don't have deferred prosecution agreements that say, you know, we're neither confirm nor deny, but we pay. The UK has them and the US has them. But the US, the SEC chair has actually said that she's going to require an admission of guilt as part of a deferred prosecution agreement. So what does that do to you as a director and officer? Okay, you admit guilt. You've already paid your penalty, your $10 million or whatever. You've paid millions and millions of investigation costs, and all of a sudden the class action lawyers come out because you are guilty. So then you have derivative actions, fraud cases, all these private practitioners. You know, it's very litigious, particularly in the US. And so it goes on from there. So really, I mean, it really comes into your consideration is like, should the company settle? Should the company settle? And if you settle, part of the settlement may be that you have ongoing a monitor, it's called, or someone to come and make sure that your compliance systems are fine. And even if you really, in fact, only had a problem over there and your general compliance program is good, you have to implement a compliance monitor over your whole operations globally, which can be very, like it can get into the hundreds of millions of dollars. So this is why it's a growth area. I also just want to end up with one comment. How am I doing on time? You're doing great. Okay, so one comment, like there is a great urge towards transparency and lots of things, but there is an interesting case going on in Canada right now, which is a mining company is in litigation with some local, it's a human rights case. But the lawyers representing the indigenous peoples in this area have alleged that there's a cause of action because the company said on its website that we volunteer to comply with best practices, the UN guiding principles, we will try to do this, we agree that we will try to implement these. And I think the words were probably too strong. We will implement these UN guiding best practices. Guess what? That lawyer for those indigenous peoples is alleging a tort of negligence because they did not comply with the UN guiding principles on human rights. Anyway, so I think that's a bad precedent.
So I think, thank you very much to all those speakers. I think that's the case and the volunteer tools on security and grants. Yeah. I would like to take 1 minute to see if my speakers want to have questions, comments for each other, and then we can pass it out to questions.
Yes, Elliot?
Okay. I feel sorry to someone. One of the things that we do is collaborate with many jurisdictions around the world. We're part of the International Foreign Bribery Task Force, the FBI, London Police, Australian, and us and more coming up. It is transnational. There's a lot of complexity, as you could well imagine, to these type of investigations. You're looking at how can you trust some of the information you might get from developing countries. If we get information from, even working with authorities, police agencies or prosecution in developing countries, can we trust the information, that we get from them? How did we get how did they get the information? So it is highly, highly complex. And ultimately, I understand that from what you mentioned, that some people, companies, they can't police everything. But I would say that ultimately there is a sense of responsibility, because it'd be too easy to say, well, I don't have any control. And ultimately, it is about the ethical behavior, the governance, and how it's implemented. And if a company can demonstrate clearly that they've done their utmost in terms of government, in terms of the compliance program, it will have a huge impact to their benefit at the end of the day. But just to say that, oh, because they're in a different country, to say, well, we don't have any control, I disagree. Because when you have a strong financial controls, it's not simply about the corruption, it's about the internal fraud and internal theft, and it's how you build that culture. So, and honestly, the employees and civil society and governments and everybody else, there's got to be some accountability and put it into play. There's got to be transparency where you can't just dismiss it, and it is incumbent upon everybody, just like governments or corporation, to put the things in place. You will never eliminate corruption. You will never. You cannot. It's not possible. But at the very least, it's when you can demonstrate you've done your utmost, that you're very, very strong. It's not just a paper exercise. You'll mitigate your risk. You'll mitigate
Okay,
your
but
exposure.
my point is really that I was at the OECD when they monitored the Canada. I was at the hearing where they came up and slapped our wrist for the one,
Yes.
slipped the guy $20 in the Red Deer Airport, and that's a bribe, and that was our one case. But it has very, very quickly changed. Like the whole attitude toward compliance has very, very quickly changed. And it's very, very, very difficult for companies to put in place these procedures sort of quickly. Some of these are historical,
Yeah.
right? So
I understand there's an evolution to all this, and I
Yeah.
agree that the state, the DBAs and the MBAs, it's like a business. Okay, we don't have that in Canada. Okay, the money doesn't go to the RCMP.
Well, keep in mind too, the Canadian legislation
Oh,
is
it doesn't
criminal
say.
only.
Yes.
yeah.
And I think Jan's example was a good
Yes.
one, because despite the fact that it's criminal,
Yeah.
and criminal, you have to have intent and mens rea, it includes willful blindness, as you said.
Absolutely.
The U.S. Enforcement, the FCPA, is so dominant that sometimes that doesn't matter. Because I think if you look at NICO, if you look at Griffiths, they were U.S. touch points in those cases.
Mhm.
The RCMP and the DOJ would have
Discussed.
discussed how they were going to deal with that, but had the RCMP not done anything about it, I'm sure we'd see something going on in the U.S. there. So the civil penalties in the U.S., the criminal penalties in the U.S., and then the shareholder litigation in the U.S. are kind of become the deciding factors or the determining factors when you're looking at these issues.
I think too, you have to have pressure to have companies develop compliance
Yes,
programs.
absolutely.
So if you don't have big penalties and big fines, then why would you invest as a company in that? I mean, I know top 10 mining companies in Canada that have just started compliance programs. So if you're a top 10 mining company in Canada, you're just starting a compliance program, you're doing it in reaction
Yes.
to worry about potential fines, right? Or you probably would have done it before as a corporate culture change, as you kind of started into your CSR, and you started doing that probably 10 years ago, the same company. So I don't know, I think you really have to also have that those external pressure points.
One of the things that we've really seen is that the corporate compliance officer used to be the general counsel of the company, but now much more, it's a chief risk officer, and like there's a growth area, guys.
Yes.
It's like the compliance officer now reports
Hint, hint.
to the board, right? And so it's really moved up the chain. And you're right, like, I mean, the poor compliance officer is sitting there and they're being told by the board, like, manage costs and, you know, do all this stuff. And then you get in front of the Department of Justice and they go, we want full, true, you know, we want all these rocks unturned to, in an investigation. And it's really challenging for companies.
There's a question.
Yeah, I'm really curious if any of you have experienced how this has affected the competitiveness of, I guess, Canadian companies operating in foreign jurisdictions. Because it makes total sense for me, I guess, the enforcement domestically, because we want efficient markets and we don't want our practices in Canada. But isn't it putting like companies at like significant disadvantage in these in countries comparatively?
Absolutely. That's my answer. And we see this particularly in Africa. We've had a number of clients complain to us that companies from certain countries like China and Russia have an advantage because of this. And I think that's something we all have to take into account. But I don't know, the RCMP might have a comment on that. Certainly, we also see companies become whistleblowers on each other in those instances too, but that doesn't necessarily help in the situation with the Chinese or Russian company.
Yeah, they don't care. But there is a reality out there, but what would you rather have? Operating under the lowest common denominator of corruption and non-ethical, or the company deciding, is it worth my while that I have to underbid this highly corrupt company to try to get a profit and increase my risk of exposure, or try somewhere else? I mean, there's an evolution to all this. And coming back to corporate social norms, you need the levers. You need to be able to have strong disincentive for participating in this type of behavior. And just like the laws, I refer back to changing social norms with drinking and driving. What changed behavior is strong laws as well as education, prevention. People recognizing that, I don't want to go to jail, I don't want to do this, but it's also bad. It's also, so we're not there in terms of the bad, but the law. So there's an evolution to this. But I think if we look at the litmus test that we should have ethical governance as what we're trying to achieve, you're going to have those countries that operate under the same rules, if you wish, the UE and others, striving for that. It will change the dynamic. We'll have a little more level playing field. It'll never be perfect, okay, because countries like Russia and China, they promote that elsewhere. But, it's just part of doing business as well. But what do you want as a shareholder? What do you want as an employee? What type of company do you want to work with?
I personally think the competitive advantage is overstated too. I think I'm sure some of it's there, but we hear it a lot, and often when you get down to it, you can break down the arguments, and they'll kind of say, well, it's not that big a competitive disadvantage, And I think one of the reasons is that on the one hand, Chinese companies are also seeking more public funds, so they're starting to list more frequently. And I think, if you look at the growth and sort of the projections in the Chinese economy, you may see more and more Chinese companies needing access to public funds, which means they have to list on, North American or Western stock exchanges, which means they are then registered in those countries, which means they are subject to these same laws. So I think we also have to keep in mind the kind of global picture, which is that, so there may be, a little bit of inequality now, but it's starting to even out. I think we're going to see even out a lot more in the future.
I agree in terms of civil society too. Isn't there more pushback as well, even in those developing countries, for having ethical behavior from any company from anywhere, where they will speak out on it? And it's those companies that don't build relationship with local communities that will not be able to succeed. And those that are corrupt from whatever country, they may be working now, but it cannot be sustainable within the atmosphere and the environment that's evolving.
Let's take a couple more questions.
Sure. Just thanks first for everyone for coming here today. Everyone touched on the idea of the huge costs associated, I suppose, with getting caught with bribery or bribing public officials, but there's also the real difficulty in implementing compliance measures. Maybe this is still kind of being felt out as to where the boundaries are, but can you give some examples of what you feel are appropriate compliance measures, like whether it's internal audits, voluntary, whatever else. And second to that, do you think that there's going to be kind of a sliding scale of what's deemed sufficiently rigorous compliance depending on the country that they're operating in?
One of the hardest things I think that we come across is actually determining if the payment is illegal. Like, because if you're in a country where they have very unclear laws, you're not always sure what you're paying for. And so I think that's one of the biggest issues is for companies to try to figure out what these payments are. Like, they have to identify who the public officials may be, which is an area in itself. It's very hard to do that in countries like China, Russia. And whether the payments are legal, that's also very, very, very hard to find out and explain to North American or UK Western style laws, because their laws are very different. In terms of, they talk about tone from the top, training is huge, and educating all the way down. Remember, you're dealing with a corporate chain where lines of reporting have to be really made clear, and all the financial payments have to be really made clear, because in the US, the books and records offense, where most of them are actually prosecuted, is not a criminal offense. Most of them, they're mostly civil. There's various strict liability offense, we fail to report. So you have to make sure your books and records get out there. I mean, I have a long list that you guys probably
the NICO case, in the order of the NICO case is a nice, neat little list of just those things Janne mentioned. It includes internal audit, as you mentioned. They have 8 or 9 things in there. That was part of the NICO order. It was actually copied from the Panelpina case under the FCPA in the United States. The Crown Counsel in the NICO case sat at his breakfast table one day, and when he was thinking of what order to do for NICO, he got out the Panelpina order and almost copied it word for word. And he actually tells that story. It's kind of interesting, but it's set out there, and I think that's pretty much, it's the same thing you do for economic sanctions compliance. It's the same thing you do for export controls. It applies across a wide range of areas where you're trying to figure out who you're doing business with, and how your product's being used, who's benefiting from your services, all those things. The one thing I would mention is I think we're getting to the point in Canada, although I'm always surprised from time to time on this, but I think we're getting to the point where Canadian executives, Canadian businesses, employees understand that you don't hand a bag of cash over to a government official. We're very rarely are we seeing direct bribes, even the kind that we saw in NICO, which essentially was like a direct bribe. We're seeing it. We're seeing companies trip up around their third-party relationships, joint venture partners, agents, so-called consultants who can help them with the lay of the land in the developing country. And there's really 3 things around that we look at. We look at screening them. We look at building in contractual obligations and certifications once you're negotiating with them after you've screened them. And then most importantly, monitoring that relationship on an ongoing basis. A lot of companies tripping up in that area. They're not auditing. They're not using the audit rights they negotiated. The agent's doing something. The agent ends up making a payment, and that falls on you as a company.
If a company takes the time before shit hits the fan to implement strong GRC processes, if they do this from tone from the top, it not only will protect them and minimize risk in terms of corruption and bribery, but also help build a very strong business culture internally that will prevent fraud, theft. It will prevent even like harassment, because they know that internally if something happens that's wrong, it will be taken care of. People will be made accountable. So it actually builds better productivity and more transparency. So more, better employees and better overall ethical behavior that actually is beneficial for a company. And that has a selling factor in terms of attracting new employees, in terms of mergers and acquisition or project with other companies, because they can demonstrate, look, this is where we're operating, as opposed to over here. So there is benefits to this that is approved, not just from the anti-corruption, or overall as a business.
And I think it's kind of an interesting thing. You've had some discussion of whistleblowers and some of these incentives created for whistleblowers to come forward because they can get a percentage of what would make you fined. But in fact, in the Canadian context, when a company's fined, where does the money go? It doesn't
General
go,
coffers.
yes, it doesn't go back to
No.
the community, the country, or to rectify
No, I mean,
harm.
I think that, you know, there might be an evolution to this. I mean, if the OECD on CAC at one point, they'll be arrested. You know, you've got funding in terms of kleptocrats that, you know, there's moving towards that now. So I think there might be an evolution where you're going to have a fine that goes, you know, $10 million for general coffers, and then punitive victim, you know, fine that of $4 million that will go back to the community. It may evolve to that. I think it makes sense to me, but, you know, we're not there yet.
I just want to also say, I've always been getting questions on, in Canada, dealing with First Nations is also a really hot button area.
Yes.
So just to be clear, I wasn't trying to justify behavior that's bad.
Okay.
I'm trying to say that sometimes it's really hard to tell what to do, and dealing with First Nations is actually a really good example.
Oh, it's highly complex.
It's highly complex, and
But
dealing with Russian
we're-
laws is highly complex. And
You've got higher costs if you react to things. Much, much higher cost. So it's included. Yeah. You know, so training is part and parcel of any company. So if you introduce this incrementally, you know, and you try to change your culture within a certain time period, you limit those costs, but you increase the benefits from it. So this is why we try to promote, you know, start now. Don't wait until something happens.
On that note,